Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Just before I get on to the topic itself, I looked at your theme topic. It says recalibrating Sri Lanka's economic trajectory towards 2025. And I have to mention this. If you are going to recalibrate Sri Lanka's economic future, we need to bring women into Sri Lanka's economic future. This panel is an all-male panel and I pointed it out. But I also looked at all your panels. You have 44 people and only 4 women. So the reason I said it is that we're trying to make this change even in politics. We have made this in the local government. We have by statute now nearly 25%. We need to change it in parliament as well. I'm sure Dr. Ambugammal will agree with me on that. But certainly I think the private sector also has to be very conscious of this because there is increasing evidence, right, of the positive contribution. I won't go into that because it's not the subject of the panel. Murtaza's framework, he talked about the market failures, social benefits, strategic development objectives, and so forth. So clearly, we need to make up our minds as to what is the point in government actually owning businesses. What is the point? So if there is a strategic reason for us to own it, either it's a service reason, market failure and there's a service reason it has to be provided, or like a bus route would be a good one. The private sector might not go down certain bus routes and therefore the state has to provide that service to the citizen, the consumer, and therefore the state might do it. There are different ways to do it. Originally we thought the state has to own to do it, but there may be other ways to do it. The private sector probably could still provide it and probably provide it better, and the state could fund it in some way. Then there are other ones which we might think it's strategically important for defense reasons, from food security to petroleum security, energy security to whatever. You might decide that the state needs to have ownership or control in that area. Now, if I'm going to use an example, like you take, for example, Ceylon Electricity Board, right? Ceylon Electricity Board, petroleum, these are the big ones, Sri Lankan Airlines, picking some of the bigger ones. If you're wondering, why are we actually hanging on to some of these? Then the electricity board has been mainly for social reasons because you want to subsidize those, if you want, at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of pricing. Then the question arises as to whether you actually need, one is you have a monopoly and for the reasons stated it breeds inefficiencies, etc. So one is you need to be clear that you need to create a competitive environment. Even if you have a strategic reason, you need to create a competitive environment. So you need to have more than one player. Now our policy, now when I talk about our party's policy, you will see that there's a gap between our party's policy and actually the government. There is a gap. So if you take the policy, is that if you have to provide that subsidy, don't compromise the institution, let the institution run efficiently, provide the subsidy through the national budget. I mean, that is the most sensible way to go about, so you have an efficient. In petroleum is another example, right? In petroleum. In petroleum, there are 2 players in petroleum now, but even an oligopoly doesn't really solve the issue, even in an oligopoly. There are other areas as well, which I won't mention. Then you take something like Sri Lankan Airlines, which there is really no strategic reason. Now, there was an expert committee recently which went with Sri Lankan Airlines, and I heard lots of views, and people came up with strategic reasons, and the strategic reasons they came up with were like, oh, it's the tourism industry, and therefore you need to have your national airline because it's a big contributor to tourism. As I said, these are highly debatable. I don't think any of the answers are cast in stone. any of these answers. But then if you look at the price we are paying for maintaining the airline, then you have to actually ask yourself the question, is the strategy really worth the cost? Because I think even strategic reasons have cost attached to it, and we often don't look at the cost attached to it. So we bought into the idea that there is a strategic reason, therefore the national airline should be there, right? And that's why now the whole strategy is, the national airline is there, then how do you minimize the losses on the national airline? So a debate is going on about it. I said in Parliament some time ago, and Dr. Wickramaratne may have been there, because if you talk about restructuring and ownership changes, the immediate response is, you're selling national assets, you're selling it to foreigners and all that. So to communicate my point, I said in Parliament one day, I am willing to give this airline for $1 to the former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. And the reason I put it like that, right, he was also laughing when he heard it, and the reason I put it like that is because it's very difficult sometimes to communicate, right, that it's not really a selling a national asset, it's actually financial terms, it's a national liability, financial terms, right, but in economic terms, it's seen as a national asset. So the bottom line is that we do not necessarily have to own, right? We do not have to own most of it, but if we decide to own something for a strategic reason, which can be debated among various people, then that involves a political price, and if there is a political price to the service that's being provided, then that should be compensated through the national budget. Everything else that you have there, right, our view is, and this policy was enunciated at the beginning, and as I said, as a government not implemented, but the party policy was enunciated, is that then we said that everything else needs to be probably commonly held, and I think Professor Shah mentioned that, right, and the kind of models in Asia were Temasek, Khazanah in Malaysia, to look at that. So you separate it politically out there. So professionals actually manage the government's interest for returns and for efficiency. And very importantly, to make sure that the fit and proper people are appointed to the boards and are actually running the boards and the senior management. In other words, remove it from the process of politicization. We went further. I remember in the discussions, right, politicians don't normally like to give up their privileges and powers that they have in actually appointing people. So the suggestion that we made was keep the nomination in the hand of the minister, right, and the appointment in the hand of the minister, but however, subject it to the fit and proper process. If it is not approved, they can't be appointed. Now we have that in the banking system, for example. The central bank as a regulator, if a name is proposed and sent to a bank board, they will say if it's fit and proper. If it's not fit and proper, then it would be rejected. But the same appointing authority could go and then start proposing new names. So you are drawing this distinction. So we were suggesting that we also look at the Temasek Khazanah kind of model for SOEs.
Eran, minute more please.
Yes, I'm finishing. Right. Then you often wonder, right, this is the policy, but why doesn't it actually get implemented? This is the policy, why doesn't it actually get implemented? And that is the issue that was raised by Suresh when he started in saying, is there a political will to actually implement? And I must admit, right, that sometimes the political will lacks, and particularly I don't blame only the politician for that, because it's a reflection of the mandate itself. And if the mandate is decisive, I think it makes it much more easier. And if the mandate is mixed, then definitely it makes it much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Eran. Dr. Wickramaratne, if I may ask you to speak next. We used in Sri Lanka as well, the concept of a holding company where all the SOEs are brought under a holding company, where the directors of the holding company, for example, are appointed, for instance, by the Constitutional Council, and so on and so forth, to create a kind of a Chinese wall between the political establishment and running SOEs on a commercial basis. Any comments, Eran?
First, I would like to say I agree with the principles that Thilan mentioned with. He talked about today. I think that not that is there room, we must have it. Our policy is that the state has responsibility in terms of a social contract for education, for health, for social transfers, looking after the underprivileged in society. But when it comes to creating economic value, the private sector must take prime place. That's our policy. We believe in it. Efficiency comes that way. Economic returns come that way. Efficient use of resources come that way. You minimize corruption in that particular way. And when you reduce the nexus with politics. And I think that, as I admitted right at the beginning, the political will lacks. We all seem to be agreeing here. But if I were to go into Parliament tomorrow and present a transaction on Sri Lankan Airlines, I wonder how many people will actually agree with me in Parliament like they would agree with me at a table like this. Because institution like that, which is highly competitive industry, and if you look at that industry globally, right, it is under strain. Many companies are going under, right? Governments just cannot compete in that space. But how much of political support will you actually get? So Temasek is important because if you have a Temasek or a Khazana, if you feel something is strategic, something you had to politically price, I suggest you take it out of that framework. Keep it out. Politically price it. Subsidize it. Put it in the national budget. Make it transparent. Everybody knows what we are doing. But in every other institution, we have to put it in an institution like that, depoliticize it, let professionals run it. If they get a return, that return comes into the treasury through taxation and otherwise, which can use for to enhance the social benefit and the social contract.
Lanka, any comments from you? Holding company model, Temasek model?
No, essentially, I think as Eran says, at the end of the day, what we must look at is a better model.
I take Sri Lankan Airlines as the example. Sri Lankan Airlines, right, can it be turned around, right, and how can it be turned around? I'm very convinced, as Thilan said, on commercial things, keeping it in government ownership and then expecting miracles just doesn't work. During the 50-day coup, a board was appointed. A chairman was appointed for Sri Lankan Airlines. It's several months later now, right? The chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines hasn't been changed. And politicians are after me saying, why haven't you been appointed minister since March? What have you been doing? Why haven't you changed the chairman? This is not an issue about people or individuals. This is a far more involved issue. We must get away from this thing that it is a far more involved issue. To the last 3 months, 2 ministers have come late for their flight, right? And they called up and they wanted the airline just held up so that they could go. Clear instructions have gone. This airline will not be held up for anybody, right? And the airline always flew on time. It's won 2 awards to being the most punctual airline in the world, the most punctual airline. But this is not about me or somebody else. The system is the issue. It's not the individual. You will have a good leader today, tomorrow somebody else will sit in that chair. It will just go back. That is why I strongly believe that state-owned enterprises, unless it is just strategic or is meeting a market failure or a development objective, if that's defined, take that out, identify it, keep it out. Everything else must go under a structure which is depoliticized and is accountable, and one day it may not even be a state-owned enterprise, it might be given completely to the private sector.
So on that score, I mean, taking away from both what Eran you said and as well as what Nalika said, there is an act out there that allows corporations, departments, boards, etc., to be all converted into limited liability companies. What's stopping government, irrespective of who the government is, what's stopping government from converting every single SOE into a corporate, bringing it under the Companies Act, and even going so far as to make it mandatory for all SOEs thereafter to abide by the listing rules. What's preventing this? Eran, I thought you played cricket, Eran, not rugby. Any one of you wants to take that on?
That's why I said in my presentation that there must be the political will. Unless it is the decided policy of a government, that certain things should be done. And that was how, as Eran mentioned, during that period, 1994 to 2005, we went ahead and took so many decisions like that. It's up to the government. So what the answer to the question is that this government has not done that. They have not thought that it is in their political interest, probably mistakenly, because anyway it's not in their interest, that they should not take that. That's why I said always it is easy to change the structures if the people feel that a progressive government is there, that a government that will look after the interests of all the employees. If the employees perceive the government as something hostile, capitalist, something that is not looking after their interests, basically, then it's very difficult.
May I just...
I want to say something quickly on that one.
Yes.
Yeah, no, this is actually, I want to say this. When that government he referred to did the privatizations, right? They did some, they PPPs, okay, call it whatever. They did some very good and successful ones. SHET was used as an example. My personal view is that should be just replicated. There's no point having a debate when it comes to the port. When you have a successful model, why not replicate it? But I might say this, because we're talking of political will. We were in the opposition. We were in the opposition then, and that helps your government, because we are a party who believes in it. What normally happens is when we put something forward, whatever they say, they generally oppose it. That's happening all the time. This week on Thursday also I'm having the problem on a different bill to do with People's Bank this Thursday. But yesterday I got all of them into a committee room in Parliament and I convinced them, don't oppose it, don't oppose it. So when you talk about political will, it's not only government, it's government and opposition must be on the same page.
Eran, I think you've got to be a bit careful on this. So if we need SOE reforms, in other words, you're saying you need to go back into opposition.
No. What you're saying? No. I can't let you get away with that. What I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, you have to build a national consensus and get away from this party-oriented thing. If we really want to take this country forward, we need to build a national consensus on this.
One thing is that to build a national consensus, you must have the skills of communication. You must be able, leaders must be able, and that is something that has happened in Sri Lanka in the past. The leaders have taken responsibility. They have explained this to the public, they have explained that to the party, and they have carried the country with them. What do we mean by carrying the country with you? You have to have those communication skills.
I wholly endorse that, sir, because I believe that one reason why there were no strikes, and I do not believe that Mrs. Chandrika Bandara and Kumaratunga lost an election because of privatization, and that was because there was multiple level stakeholder engagements right from the trade union levels to the ministerial level, analysis done to justify why a PPP or a privatization should take place. And when the transaction was executed, it was done through a competitive process. So one more point I want to add about your comment on land. I have been saying this for 10 years, or even longer, almost 20 years, that land price mispricing is one of the key causes of misallocation of investment by the private sector as well as by the government sector. We must go back to a model of public-private partnership in land pricing and being more market-oriented. Let me just give you two examples. When we quadrupled the number of private hospitals in Sri Lanka in the late 1990s, when Apollo Hospital, Lanka Hospitals was built, we adopted a land pricing model that worked around the government chief values valuation, which permitted about more than 1,500 hospital beds to be added. We permitted the private investor to submit proposals that allowed them to pay over a period of time, as opposed to paying the 3-4 billion rupees in today's money up front. Secondly, when we called for tenders for affordable housing in Millennium City and Nivasipura, where 3,000 affordable houses were built, the land pricing formula was left open, and the RFPs were issued to commercial banks where they would identify the developer and also propose mortgages. So I believe that we first must, as a government, identify for what purpose a particular land parcel should be suitable for. If it is agriculture, let the private sector determine what the land pricing should be. But we as a government need to understand what the objective of that particular land parcel. Is it going to be a high-rise apartment? Is it going to be a supermarket? Is it going to be something else, a warehouse? Because each one of those businesses means the land pricing formula is different. So I have always been advocating a two-envelope system when it comes to land pricing. First you open the investment proposal, then you open the land pricing proposal.
I agree with one quick comment.
I'll give you the last word, Eran, because Dr. Anil wants to say something. And
So about the models and some structures we discussed, there is nothing wrong with exploring the possibilities of just adapting and using models that have been already developed and been exercised successfully in other countries, but precaution is there. So that we have to understand all those things countries would tend to embrace them and implement. So later on they fail lots of prices and failures. So what we from PP's point of view, what we suggest is just explore, discuss and open up discussions. Especially we believe that we can find our own models and our own structures where if all the key stakeholders are brought up for the discussions and given adequate opportunities. So that could be a good solution, we believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you that I have the last word. Referring to what Dr. Amadugama said, that leaders haven't really been communicating, and I'm hoping against hope, irrespective of the political divide, that we will have a new generation of leaders in this country, not only in the private sector, but in politics as well.
thank you. Both of us